good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. Let's begin with news that the government is considering setting up a new oversight body to deal with possible misconduct in 20 law enforcement agencies. Now, the idea is to turn the current Enforcement Agency Integrity Commission, or EAIC, into the IPCMC, which will deal specifically with complaints against the police force. Now, the IPCMC, of course, stands for the Independent Police Complaints and Misconduct Commission.
Right. So what's interesting about this is that, Melisa, we've had some debate and there's been a failure, as it were, to push through the IPCMC at the last parliamentary session. But the government has vowed to continue the stakeholder conversations and engagements in order to realize this, and which I think is central to its own agenda as a reforming government. They are now saying, well, let's not just look at the IPCMC, let's look at the other 20 enforcement agencies that also need to have an oversight mechanism. The idea is that in all democratic societies, you build strong institutions, you will need every enforcement agency, which is itself a watchdog body, will need a watchdog.
All right, so a watchdog for the watchdogs. Now, so in your eyes, Sharaad, this is good news, right? So because while I am against increasing bureaucracy, generally, this is good because what we want to do is make sure that there are checks and balances. There are, like as you mentioned, a watchdog to watch the watchdogs.
Yeah, and it's about it's not calling into question internal mechanisms, but it's about saying, well, those internal mechanisms can be gamed. If there's a culture develops within those organizations to protect their own and so on. These are things that happen everywhere in the world. Malaysia is not unique. So the best practices globally are, in fact, to create independent institutions that have an oversight responsibility. And I think, along with, of course, issues of a strong press that does good work, that does investigative work, university systems and academics are doing a deep dive into possible collusion, corruption, all those issues that these mechanisms are set up to thwart.
Okay, so this is all part of the reform agenda that we so often talk about, right? So I guess small incremental steps like this will be good for the long-term strengthening of our institutions, of the reform agenda, of institutional reform that we so often talk about and wish to see more progress of.
And also, of course, when talking about reform is the question of resistance to reform. We see that happening with the IPCMC. The question is, with these other 20 enforcement agencies, will we see the same thing play out? So we wait for the details for each of those 20 enforcement agencies, looking at what kind of setup the government is thinking about, and I think being very mindful about the possibility of resistance.
Right, yeah, just using IPCMC as an example. Okay, in other news, we have last Friday, Wisma Putra officially confirming that Malaysia will be reopening the embassy in Pyongyang. This is following the resumption of bilateral ties with North Korea. Of course, recall that the diplomatic row that resulted between Malaysia and North Korea following the assassination of Kim Jong-un's estranged half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, in February of 2017. And I guess now we're looking to rekindle those ties.
Yeah, I don't know about rekindling, but I think normalization is the word that's often used.
Well, we suspended diplomatic ties when that incident happened, and now a resumption of that.
Yes. So the North Korean embassy here is going to be reopened, I believe. And what's interesting about it is what it says about Malaysia's own policy abroad, right? So we had, as you know, as Iraq has recently experienced the assassination of a figure by a foreign power on sovereign land. In this case, it was Malaysia several years ago. I do think Prashant Parameswaran in The Diplomat makes an argument that this is really part of the way Malaysia sees itself. Now, as a small and middle-income country, wanting a multilateral, rules-governed international system, that's what benefits small and middle-sized nations, right? So getting everybody into the conversation, not isolating North Korea, is in fact the end, I think, end game for this strategy.
So the idea is to motivate North Korea into having diplomatic relations. We want to be part of that bigger bigger storyline. Also, I think perhaps, as part of Malaysia's foreign policy approach, the idea is maybe Malaysia can help shape some of the regional issues. Maybe Malaysia can play its role in that. Given that we are small, but we have a relatively, I guess, good brand on the diplomatic stage.
Yeah, in fact, we had the KL Summit, which proves that Malaysia has, and continues to want to punch above its weight, right? So that has been the strategy, and Dr. Mahathir has famously kind of pushed Malaysia to the forefront, despite our reasonably small size as a nation, and sought a public stage for his own views of the world. So, as we said before, as commentators have noted, he's rather idiosyncratic in his approach to foreign policy. But in this case, there might be some real coherent logic to doing this.
Do you think that this will go down well with the public, or do you think that most Malaysians tend not to care about foreign policy in their daily lives?
Well, I think people do care about foreign policy, but it might be very specific to things like the Palestinian issue, or where there are co-ethnic issues, so, Sri Lankan Tamils here or Tamils in this country, and their view of, say, the Sri Lankan civil war conflict. All these things are there, but the question is whether we go beyond the emotive and reach a better understanding of the kinds of approaches, realist and so on and so forth, arguments that there might be about foreign policy approaches.
Okay, in other news, we have the Pakatan Harapan government ministers having been asked to prepare report cards to evaluate their performance for the year 2019. Now, according to Putrajaya sources, the report cards will include assessments of the work done by the minister and the overall achievements of their ministry. These report cards are expected to then be presented to Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad at the cabinet meeting tomorrow. I think so far all but 2 ministers have submitted their 2019 report card to the Prime Minister.
Yeah, what's interesting is some of the reports tell you that all but 2, but they don't actually name those 2 ministries.
Yes, I know. We have to deduce ourselves.
Yes, well, I think the other thing that interests Malaysians is whether we're going to see some of the cabinet ministers removed from office because of the perception that they've underperformed. I think at this point in time, that's still moot. What seems to be, what the Prime Minister seems to be intimating is that there might be a swap around rather than removals of individuals.
Sources have said that a snap reshuffle could happen involving 2 or 3 posts. Now, the question is, will the kind of report card tallies be directly related to the posts that are being considered for a change? Now, I don't know whether this is a good thing, because often, report card tallies may not be reflective of how well a ministry is doing. As we talked about earlier, reform takes longer than just 1.5 years or 1 year. And it may not look as sexy on a report card, but it is instrumental to creating a true change in Malaysia.
Right, and because the ministers and their ministries might have a much more rosy, perspective of their own performance. So if you take the resignation of Dr. Mazli Malik recently, his report card would have been glowing, but his removal obviously was calculated in terms of larger issues. There was a report since denied that it was because Mazli was planning to reopen a Saudi-backed peace center, a counter-terrorism center. Now that's been denied, but there's very interesting dynamics. Some of them might have to do with political parties themselves and the dynamics there, not necessarily just your performance in the ministry.
You know what I want? I want these report cards to be publicly available, which I'm sure most of them are, but also to be fact-checked, right? So let's not take the report cards at face value. Let's go and check whether they are truly, being delivered by said ministries. Okay, all right, we're going to come back and take a closer look at the bushfires in Australia after this on Consider This. Don't go anywhere.